As the Middle East erupts again, it's very important that we get to the bottom of what's really going on, which is not often explained in mainstream media. To speak about this, we have, of course, Abhijit Iyer Mitra ji, who is a leading Indian strategic affairs expert and who, of course, needs no more introduction than that. Namaste, my name is Anandi, and welcome to Citti's Current Affairs Show. Abhijit ji, thank you so much for joining me today. I hope you're well.
Namaste, and thank you for having me on. Yes, I am well, and I trust you are well, and our audience is well.
I am very well, and of course, I'm sure our audience is doing very well as well. Abhijit ji, let's just hit the ground running. First of all, do you think there's a mass movement to stop Israel from wiping out Hamas? Because if it was about saving lives, if the goal is to save human lives, then why not protest about what was going on in Syria? Why not protest about what the Iranian women were going through? Are UN countries and pro-Palestinian activists using all their global human rights connections, whatever they may have, in order to save Hamas from extinction? What do you think about that?
So, the issue has always been, there's been a severe inconsistency in what we've seen coming out of the West in general. And I think it's very important to note that the West isn't the only person that's going to sort of dampen Israel's military campaign. The pressures on Israel come from different sectors, but also remember, a lot of what is said in public directly contradicts what's said in private. I know for a fact, for example, Saudi Arabia is like all gung ho about Israel going in on Gaza and finishing off Hamas. They've just asked the Israelis in public, they're quite critical of Israel. In private, they're extremely supportive of Israel. They've just asked the Israelis to keep the body count down to a minimum so that it doesn't embarrass them. Right? I think a lot of countries are sending out that message to Israel, number one. Number two, let's talk about the public aspect of this because I think that's what most of our audience ends up seeing. Now, what happens out here is this has been a particularly toxic byproduct of intersectionality, where, if you are gay, you have to support Black Lives Matter. If you are gay, you have to support gender change surgery and this whole nonsense about gender ideology. And if you're all both of these, then you have to support Palestine somehow. Right. Now, understand what the rationale behind all of this is. The left thrives on creating uh, disaffected parties. They need to create rage in order to create international revolution. Revolution is not possible without rage. Rage has to be generated. All right. And so, what these people do is they create these so called intersectional groupings which are so farcical. Hamas throws homosexuals off tower blocks the way ISIS did, and yet you'll find queers for Palestine. It's a bit like chickens for KFC. There's actually a meme doing the round saying thank you Benjamin Netanyahu because now Hamas can't execute us anymore because all the high rises are being flattened. Right now, this has been a problem that has been pointed out. This is not new. People assume this is new because they don't realize that this is the latest phase of Marxo communism. But this actually started during the Russian Revolution itself. If you go back to the Russian Revolution, all the language used about bourgeois oppressors and feudal oppressors in Russia was never used about the much more feudal and much more bourgeois oppressors in Central Asia. Far from it, they were all, fated as oppressed minorities who needed understanding and sympathy. And the moment the communists came to power, what did they do? The first people that they executed, even before they finished executing all the czarists, was to go and execute all the Islamists in Central Asia, and completely wipe the slate clean. On the other side, what happens in Iran is that the Islamists come to power in 1979, and what do? They kill off all the communists in Mashhad first, even before they kill off all the monarchists. So, it's a very, I'm very surprised that people don't understand what this intersectionality playbook is. Now, why is Islamism and leftism so compatible in opposition but never in power, because they both understand political power very, very well. They're both extremely ruthless. And once they come to power, they realize the only person who can understand them at a theoretical level and destroy each other at a physical level is the other, right? So they're always allies out of power. They're very strong allies out of power because they march in lockstep, and they are each other's worst enemies when they come to power. This is number one. Why is that? Because Islam is a congregational religion. You can pray 5 times a day, but every Friday you are required to come out to the mosque. So the congregational power of a mullah or a muezzin is almost institutionalized. You cannot be a Muslim and not go to a mosque. Wherever you are, at least on Friday, you have to go to the mosque to attend prayer. And congregation, along with joblessness, is a very, very potent combination. Because joblessness, economic deprivation, plus congregationism it's almost a riot waiting to happen. Okay. Leftists are very similar. Why do they have a protest culture? It isn't because they like to protest to everything. And most communists are usually, these kind of quasi employed people. Services, essentially, these days, because we've moved towards services, you don't have blue collar factory laborers anymore. If you look at the employment, the sector wise breakup of any developed country, it's only 20 to 25% working in manufacturing. The rest is in services, about 70 to 80% in services. And what happens out there is you're largely jobless, because services are really, they're not really white collar. You have the delusion of being white collar, but you're mostly quasi blue collar, with a lot more spare time now on your hands. And so, what communists do by creating protests is they replicate this congregationalism of Islam, where you're brought out onto the streets and you get used to congregating and protesting. They can literally generate, because it's conditioned into you, they can literally generate protests on the ground, essentially create overnight shock troops to go around, rioting, ransacking, doing whatever when required, when whipped up into a frenzy. And cumulatively, what ends up happening is that this is a very, very potent, two rioting wings that can come together and weaponize each other in sync to magnify each other's abilities. One becomes a megaphone to the other. They also have institutionalized online mobs like this. So the congregationalism is something they understand very, very well. And they've also taken this, projected this onto the internet and social media. So you'll find a lot of the information saturation. It doesn't matter if it's fake or real, they just saturate the waves. So, for example, when you had the 40 babies beheaded story come out, I never bought it. But the whole of the media was saturated, social media at least, was saturated with demands, show us proof. More than the 40 babies beheaded story, it was 80-90% of my timeline was show us proof. This is all lies. Clearly a congregationalized online mob. But when Hamas's health ministry puts out this thing saying 8,000 Gazans are dead so far, none of this 80% that demanded proof for 40 babies beheaded are demanding proof to show us the bodies. They just take it lock, stock, barrel, and it's 8,000 people killed. So it's a very, very potent force, and it keeps going back to what Lenin said: every idea is worth 1,000 pages of theory. Every piece of news, fake or real, is worth 1,000 tweets. They saturate your timeline, and so you simply cannot filter out what is real from what is false. And sheer probability dictates that you will fall for their narrative over some other narrative.
Well, there seems to be so many layers to this. It's all just complex and really, really intricate. Thank you for going into detail about that. I think that'll be really useful for our viewers to know. So at the moment, what is Israel's specific military objective? What does that mean exactly? in terms of going about destroying Hamas, wiping them out. How do we explain in a sort of for the layperson what exactly is happening? And if you've just seen recently, just in the last few moments, Israel has blown up the home of a senior Hamas leader as the IDF continues to target their top leaders. So, is their strategy sound? What would you? How would you respond to that?
Look, I do have my reservations about Israeli strategy. On one hand, I've seen them adapt quite well, and on the other, I don't think they've really thought through the second and third order effects. Even if you adapt tactically, you might not adapt strategically. Let me give you an example of what I mean. The thing that sticks in my memory is the first, because I remember it vividly about, what was it, 20 or so, but more than 20 years back, which was the first Russian invasion of Chechnya. And you can't really say invasion because Chechnya is a part of Russia, but the siege of Grozny. And what the Russians did was that they flattened Grozny with shelling and aerial bombardment. The problem was it created a whole new network through the rubble, through which Chechen rebels were able to completely decimate Russian armored formations going in. Right. Now, as a response to that, Russia developed active protection systems, which is basically there are radars on all four sides of the tank. And the moment it detects a missile or a projectile coming in, it kind of releases a sort of bullet to hit a bullet kind of thing, which stops that thing from hitting the tank. Obviously, in an urban environment, the reaction times are very short. In the field, you can detect the missile, those radars on all four sides, because it's a completely staring array. You get 360-degree radar vision, is able to detect the missile from very far and deploy these countermeasures. In an urban area where the missile would be fired from maybe 10, 15 meters away, the reaction time would be like that. Can that be achieved? We don't know. Do the Israelis have the technology? Yes. But something new has been introduced, which is these little commercial drones, which most of us use for photography, which are now being used to drop these little grenade type things, which are very effective against tanks, by the way, on the roof. Now, if you look, the way a tank works is that the front armor is the thickest. Now, this would be normal armor. But if I slant this, and this is why the fronts of tanks are always slanted, without any increase in weight, the thickness of penetration has become almost three times the size. If the armor was straight, it was just this much. But just by slanting it, the projectile now has to go almost three times the thickness, right? So what ends up happening is uh, tanks on all their sides are fairly well protected. On the top, they are not. And what these new commercial drone tactics that we've seen in Ukraine are doing is that they are utilizing that weakness to drop things on tanks. Even this, the Israelis have adapted to. They have started putting these little, cages almost on top, and what happens is, even before the projectile can be dropped, it explodes on the cage. And so it's not very sophisticated technology. It's a kind of window grills or bars that you put on your windows or whatever if you're in a high crime area kind of thing. And it actually very effectively stops these grenades from actually hitting the armor. Now, brilliant tactical innovation so far, done very rapidly so far. The problem is, once they go into Gaza, do they have the same tactics? Have they got the tactics thought out? I don't think so. What happens after you have gone in? One of the things I think is very easy to do. Now, there are three ways of dealing. Hamas lives in these underground cities. There is an entire underground city under Gaza. There is an underground city under Khan Yunis. There is probably more tunnels in Gaza than there are rat holes in Delhi and rat nests in Delhi. Um, it is a whole city. I have actually been to the northern border with Lebanon and looked at ground penetrating radar images. What looks like a very, sort of unoffensive little village on the hill on the Lebanese side of the border. You look at it through a ground penetrating radar, and it's almost like an iceberg where 9/10 of it is actually underground. And there's a whole city underground of tunnels. It's a whole hive of tunnels underground. right? And which is, it's a city. What's on top is a village, what's underground is a city with concentrations of ammunition, etc., etc., etc. Now, I think one of the very easy things, there are three ways of getting rid of this. One is the high technology and what I believe a very stupid way of going about things, which is, sending these rover kind of bots into this with cameras where you're constantly tracking them and go after people individually. The second is, remember, these things, the deeper they go, they require ventilation, they require cooling, they require all kinds of ground support infrastructure to be pumped down to them. And what ends up happening is that you can cut off the ventilation shafts, you can cut off the cooling shafts, you can cut off the air pumps and essentially asphyxiate them down there. The problem is, how many of those will you go after? Do you even know where all the air vents are? Do you know where all the ventilation shafts are? Do you know where the pumps, etc., are? You probably won't. The third is probably the easiest thing to do, which is to pump a whole load of water into those tunnels and just keep that water there for about a month or 2 months. Because no matter how well stocked you are going to run out of oxygen ultimately. And no amount of ventilation is going to be able to save you when your entire tunnel system is flooded. Now, I don't know which one of these solutions the Israelis are going to use, but they're definitely going to be using a combination. I think the third one is the most effective. But then again, what, where I don't think the Israelis have thought through is, they've thought through what's going to happen today and tomorrow. They haven't thought through what's going to happen day after tomorrow and the week after that and the month after that. So assume you've gotten all the tunnels, and over a 6-month campaign, you've individually vetted every single Gazan and killed or arrested all the Hamas linked ones. Because remember, Hamas has anywhere between 35 to 50,000 troops in Gaza. And mind you, most of these troops are kids. 44% of Gaza is under 14 years of age. And they have all been bred very specifically to be human shields. Hamas encourages having more kids so that they can become human shields, and so that the lack of prospects leads to rage, which leads to radicalization, which fills their ranks. These people abuse their own people a lot more than anybody else abuses them. Everybody forgets that the Germans were the first and the worst victims of Nazi Germany. Everybody forgets that the Chinese were the first and the worst victims of the Communist Party of China. Everybody seems to forget, including, unfortunately, the Palestinians themselves, that the Gazans are the first and the worst victims of Hamas and Palestinian international jihad themselves. Okay? So, I mean, I don't know what it is, Stockholm syndrome or call it what you will, but that is the reality of what is happening in here. But then what? You've gotten rid of Hamas as much as you can. Hamas's leadership is in Turkey, it is in Doha, in Qatar, and there is help coming from Iran. What are you going to do about that? We don't want this to become a situation like Afghanistan, where the Americans went on attacking the symptom, which was the Taliban, but not the cause, which was ISI headquarters in Rawalpindi, right? Pakistan intelligence headquarters in Rawalpindi, which was directing the entire Taliban campaign against the allies. And ultimately, after 20 years, they had to leave. And remember, the Israelis don't have a good track record on this. They went into South Lebanon. It was a 20-year occupation of South Lebanon. It achieved nothing in the end. Are they able to think through things? I am not too sure, because it is rage fueled at the moment. I don't think they're thinking through what comes next. We have heard very vague statements that we will create a government that is going to be civilian, free from Hamas control. But see, if you create a civilian government free from Hamas control, how are you going to deprogram the last 20 to 25 years of severe radicalization that has happened? The socioeconomic factors like a high youth bulge combined with high unemployment for which there is no solution, and that feeding radicalization and the recreation of Hamas, and an international Hamas leadership that's just waiting to utilize that radicalization to rebuild the organization. I don't think any of these things have been thought through. Neither has a general escalation happening. So, for example, what if Hezbollah gets involved? I think people don't realize that Hezbollah has something like almost 500,000 rockets in storage in Lebanon. That is more, and the amount of accuracy we've seen with these rockets, it keeps increasing with every iteration. Before, out of every 100 rockets, maybe only 2 rockets used to fall in urban concentrations because they were unguided. Increasingly, we're seeing rudimentarily guided, but at least about 10 to 15% of them are falling in urban areas. They are no longer falling in unpopulated areas. And 10 to 15% of 500,000 is still a few 100,000 rockets. Well, not a few 100,000, but it's still several tens of thousands of rockets. And Israel doesn't have counters to that. So you're going to see a lot of uh, very significant losses. And then what happens? Does an invasion of Lebanon and southern Syria happen? And what is Iran going to do sitting by while it watches its proxy out there, Hezbollah, get destroyed? It's not going to sit by and allow its most potent external asset to get destroyed. Will it do what Saddam Hussein did in 1990, which is fire long range missiles at Tel Aviv? I personally think that is what the Iranians will do. And they will use an Israeli conventional retaliation against Iran. They will claim that this is humanitarian intervention to prevent massacre. And when Israel hits back, they will claim it is aggression and detonate a nuclear device and declare themselves a nuclear power. I think a lot of this gambit has been done so that Iran can actually declare itself a nuclear power and detonate a nuclear device.
Well, I'll be getting into what the consequences are for the rest of the world and other nations in a little bit. So I'm glad you touched upon that because I will be getting into that. It seems from what you're saying that potentially Israel's reaction is more of a knee-jerk reaction, which could be understandable, but I think, like you said, they need to think about the long-term strategic planning. And it's just a crying shame that there's no sort of global outcry on the children of Gaza who were being radicalized and groomed into committing heinous acts and being part of a horrific group. So I think that could be another story in and of itself. If we go back to October the 7th, when this all began, could you just give an insight as to what exactly happened in that? What was Hamas trying to achieve? Was it, for example, trying to scupper Israeli and Saudi peace talks, or is there something more to it? Could you just give us an idea of what was happening then?
Look, there are, first of all, we tend to attribute great wisdom to terror organizations which actually don't exist. I mean, to be a terrorist, you have to be a serious psycho to begin with, right? I mean, there has to be something fundamentally wrong with your upbringing, either child abuse or whatever, or societal abuse or something like that, or I don't know, something epigenetic or something genetic to end up like that, number one. But terror organizations, for organizational reasons, are incapable of thinking through their actions or the consequences of their actions. We've seen this time and time again. There's a reason for it. If a government wants to think through something, it has foreign ministries and embassies. So assume I am the government of India. I want to attack Anandi Shah. And, I say I want to come and kill you, Anandi. Okay. Uh, I will then ask and assume I'm the prime minister. I will first ask first I'll ask the defense minister, give me a plan to kill Anandi. Okay. Then, because of bureaucratic reasons, that note will go to the finance minister and it will go to the external affairs minister. Immediately, the external affairs minister will contact their ambassador in London, and Vikram Doraiswamy in London will say, no, 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 please don't do this because Anandi Shah is an important member of the community. And if you have her blown up, the British government will impose sanctions on you. And the moment this sanctions note comes, then the finance minister gets agitated and she says, the industry minister gets involved and he's like, no, 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 we can't afford to lose Rolls Royce engines from Britain, so you can't do this. And then the finance ministry says, look, there's all these international sanctions that are going to come into play and you can't do this. So there is a natural organizational check and balance which makes your analysis completely interdisciplinary and imposes lots of restrictions on you. It imposes reality checks on you. A terror organization, by its very nature, does not have that kind of uh, interdisciplinary analysis. They're very focused on terror and political goals to the exclusion of economics, to the exclusion of international relations, because, of course, nobody recognizes them internationally. Nobody is going to give them an honest assessment. When I want to kill you, for example, Vikram Doraiswamy will go talk to the Foreign Office or whatever and find out, if he kill a British citizen, how are you going to react? Uh, they can't do that. They can't have those conversations, right? Nobody's even going to entertain them. They tend to be very self referential. They tend to live in an echo chamber that is self reinforcing. And so they can't think beyond their actions. So, I think it's very, um, first, I think it's very, very uh, problematic to assume they thought through the consequences of their actions, or that they even thought through the timing of the actions, because what we found is very frequently terror actions, even when at the behest of a state actor occur, do not think through consequences. So, for example, when Pakistan carried out the attack on the Indian parliament, did they think through what was going to happen down the line? No. They were just thinking through the glory of the attack, the shock that they were going to create to the Indian state. Same with the Mumbai attacks. Did the Taliban, for example, force Al Qaeda to think through the actions of 9/11? No. Right. And Kargil, especially, imagine the Prime Minister of Pakistan being forced to Washington, D.C. to crawl on all fours and beg for a ceasefire. Right. So now we come to stage two, which is, let us assume that this was done to stop the the IMEC corridor, the India, Middle East, Europe corridor, or it was done to prevent the Saudi-Israel peace deal from fructifying, which would be essentially, the notion that Hamas was acting at the behest of Qatar or Iran or something like that. Okay, so we first dealt with if Hamas was acting by itself. Now let's deal with if it was acting as a patsy for somebody else. The problem there again becomes that, if it was acting as a patsy for somebody else, did they actually think through what happens now? Because if the escalation we spoke about, going after Hezbollah, etc., happens, nobody is happier than Saudi Arabia if Israel destroys Hezbollah in addition to Hamas. Nobody is happier if Israel destroys Hamas, which is a significant recipient of Iranian weapons, than the Saudis. So, I don't think they've thought those things through either. And I don't think Iran's influence on Hamas has also thought through the consequences of its actions.
So, long and short of it is that you're saying that there has been no underlying agenda behind the attack in the way that
If
others
there
perceive.
if there has been an agenda, say, to cancel the IMEC corridor, no. I personally feel that the Saudi Israeli relationship will only be strengthened as a result of this, not publicly, but in private. And
Interesting. Thank you for that. You touched upon this a little earlier. You said that people forget that the first and the worst victims of this, and in this case, are the Palestinian civilians. So, could you give us a little bit more of an insight into exactly what Hamas does to its own people? Because everyone seems to blame Israel for Gaza's present condition, when Hamas seems to be running what you could say is a police state, and the siege really isn't Israel's fault, and provides Gaza with services that they really shouldn't have to, and that we should remember that Gaza has been an independent country since 2005, and it's been in charge of its own affairs since then. So, how would you respond to how Hamas treats its own people?
I spent 10 days in Gaza, and it was the most bizarre experience I've ever lived through. I've been to North Korea, and trust me, North Korea is nowhere near as bizarre as Gaza is. And there's a reason for it. The people in Gaza, it's a very small plot of land. It's just a quarter the size of Delhi. the physical size of Delhi, where I am. And what ends up happening is you have to, everything is based on patronage. Things don't happen unless you're close to Hamas. Uh, there are gangs out there of different factions of terrorists who you have to pay homage to, either in terms of services or in terms of money. Everybody's too scared to talk about anything because surveillance is all pervasive out there. You never know what conversation Hamas is listening in on, even at home. You don't know which member of your family is radical enough to go rat you out to Hamas. So you can't even have a husband and wife conversation at home. Justice is nasty, it is brutal. You can be declared a collaborator at any point of time and be executed. I don't think people realize how nasty the rule of Hamas is, but there's a very good indicator. You know, all these reporters, quote unquote, reporters in Gaza, who are suddenly achieving celebrity fame on Instagram and Twitter for their on ground reporting. How is it that in the last 17 years of Hamas single party rule, have not reported on a single scam, on a single piece of disaffection, on a single piece of corruption, on a single piece of civic malfunction, even out of Gaza? Do you believe that a government can rule for 17 years and still retain 100% of the people's affection and function absolutely flawlessly to keep that 100% people's affection? Obviously not. And that is the clearest sign of absolute pervasive media control that you have. The second thing in all of this is you will also find that all these reporters are very conveniently at the same spot where all the other cameras are. How do they just know where to congregate? I've always found that very strange. How is it that they all take the exact same line? I also find that very strange. How is it that there is absolutely no divergent voice coming out of Gaza at all? It is a sociological and anthropological impossibility. And yet we see it in Gaza. Now, the problem is, from my own experiences on the ground in Gaza, what I've found is that that is indeed the case, and it is entirely driven by fear that people dare not open their mouths. Because their intelligence system that targets their own people is very, very, very good. If you are planning on doing anything, Hamas will get to know about it and they will take action. So it's not a nice place to be. And you get double victimized because you're victimized for living under Gaza, under Hamas, that you can't travel outside this sort of 70 kilometer by 7 kilometer strip of land, and you have to endure Hamas. And because the children are brave, what do kids know? The children are told everything. I mean, you know, when you're a 5, 6 year old kid, you don't understand the complexities of sociology or anything like that. So you're like, oh yeah, 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 let's blame the Israelis. Let's blame the Israelis for everything. The, the dissent, you will be killed instantly. And it's the Lord of the Flies situation where 44% under 14, heavily radicalized kids who are have no access to any alternate point of view, uh, completely under the control of Hamas to do whatever they want.
Something for the so-called activists and human rights groups to think about a bit more, especially when they're marching in the streets. Right, you talked about the influence of Iran over this. Now I just want to come to the fact that there are rumors that apparently that Russia's secret forces was either were directly or indirectly involved in the way that Hamas have attacked. It seems to have been a more sort of highly tactical invasion, and seem allegedly to have Russia's fingerprints. Is it possible that Putin has tried to divert flow of weapons from the West, from Ukraine to Israel? What do you think about Russia's involvement in this?
I've been making this point since day one, since day two, since the 8th of October, that this was too sophisticated for either Iran or Syria or anybody or Hezbollah to pull off like this. And I saw a Russian. Has anybody else written on it so far?
Um, I don't think extensively. This is just some rumors at the moment. So
Yeah. Look, what we see both in terms of the information suppression that Israel wasn't able to pick up on the signs, as well as the coordination of the attack on the other hand, uh, for me, the sophistication is entirely Russian. But that doesn't mean that somebody couldn't have independently come up with that kind of sophistication, either, number one. And number two, does it suit Russia? Yes, but that doesn't necessarily mean that Russia engineered it. How does it suit Russia? Does it divert weapons away from Ukraine? Yes. But remember, Ukraine is mostly using dumb ammunition. Israel overwhelmingly uses air launched smart ammunition, right? So, partially, yes, it will divert the flow of, say, 155 millimeter shells from the Ukraine battlefield, maybe. But the Israelis don't like to expend too much ammunition. They like to get their intelligence together very, very carefully before they go in. So instead of having to fire 20 shells, they just have to fire that one shell and do the job with it. There's extreme economy of effort in Israel, which we do not see in Ukraine. So even if the Russians did it, will it divert weapons to some extent? Yes. Will it divert arms? No, because I see the two requirements as being very different. One mostly for dumb weapons in Ukraine, which is all World War One style trench warfare with dumb weapons, and for smart weapons in Israel. But funds and media attention, yes. There will be a significant diversion of funds from, because remember, smart weapons are infinitely more expensive than dumb weapons. A shell, a Russian 155 millimeter shell would cost something like about 15 to $20. An American 155 millimeter smart shell with terminal guidance would cost you something like $25,000. Where is $15 and where is $25,000? So it's literally the amount of money diversion out of Ukraine is going to be massive. Uh, Precisely because Israel uses smart weapons, which Ukraine does not. I think that's where the thing is. And I think that is why Zelensky was trying first to visit Israel, which Israel said no for. They didn't want him coming in his fatigues and making this about himself, number one. And then Zelensky tried using the attack on the airport yesterday in Dagestan, in Makhachkala, to underscore that Putin is anti Semitic and whatnot. Uh, Completely ironic given the fact that there's not a single imagery that comes out of Ukraine that doesn't bear Nazi iconography. Literally, I mean, even the Ukrainian Twitter handles can't put out a single photo that doesn't have Nazi imagery. So, it's nobody's even talking. I mean, this is the longest period of time that Ukraine has been out of the news cycle since February 24th of last year.
that's true. Well, that's very intriguing, and thank you for elucidating this point. So, just a little bit before, you talked about the potential consequences for other nations. And now I want to put to you, is there genuinely a threat of another global war? And by that, I mean World War III, in the sense that it seems that Putin has made an assertion that this could be the case. Arab armies are much stronger now. Turkey is now threatening they could land in Gaza at any point. So could this lead to a bigger war with Turkey, Iran, other Arab countries, Russia, China? Because then Israel would have no chance. And just to report that yesterday, just very recently, the German defense minister said that there's a risk that the two ongoing conflicts of our times, the biggest ones at the moment, Russia, Ukraine, and Israel Hamas, will spill over into Europe, and that Germany should prepare and be ready for war. What do you make of that?
Yeah. So, first of all, I think Germany is the last person to talk because they've demilitarized so completely. It'll take them at least another 20 to 30 years to, because, demilitarization isn't simply getting rid of your arms. It's also your army losing training. And armies to get trained up take 15, 20 years easy. You can't create an army from scratch in 2 to 3 years, right? Number one. Number two, the possibility of escalation. See, yes and no. Yes, because like all economic theories are based on two assumptions: ceteris paribus and man is rational. Now, ceteris paribus is all other things being equal, which we know that they are not, and man being rational. Well, look, I think that's we know that men aren't rational, right? Or men and women aren't rational, and even definitions of rationality vary. Iran's definition of rationality may be very different from India's definition of rationality, which may be very different from Idi Amin's definition of rationality, which may be very different from my definition of rationality. Uh, so, assuming that there are several different rationalities, even assuming that man is rational, and everything saying equal, nobody thought the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo was going to lead to World War One, but it did. Sometimes events overtake attempts to stop events. So, uncontrolled escalation, possibly. As of now, I do see calibration. I do not think Turkey is a very savvy actor. They like to, I think the Hindi word is bhadkao fai, but what? Insight. Insight. Bhadkao Fai isn't even Hindi, is it? It's Hinglish because Bhadkana is Hindi, Bhadkao Fai is English. Fai is English. So, yeah, to incite others into doing things that they don't do themselves. Turkey isn't going to land. They might start supplying weapons and things like that to Hamas. Let's see what happens. Uh, as of now, I don't see the possibility of uncontrolled escalation, controlled escalation leading up to Iran detonating a nuclear bomb. Yes, I think that's my preferred escalation trajectory. But remember, these things are highly unpredictable. Can it lead to uncontrolled escalation and a larger conflagration? Possibly. Um, Impossible to say right now.
Right. Guess we're just going to have to wait and see about that. What do you think about the very, very recent report that Chinese companies have removed Israel from their digital maps and that President Xi Jinping has formally backed Palestine? What do you think of that development?
I'm not surprised. I'm not surprised because China has a great interest in destabilizing that entire region. You see, because the way China functions is, and this is not new, this is old Chinese strategic thinking. If you read this paper by Alistair Ian Johnston that he wrote almost 25, 30 years back on the strategic culture in China, uh, for the last 3,000 years, the whole point of Chinese strategy has been maximum stability at home, maximum instability abroad. Because unlike America, which feels the need to solve other people's problems for them, China doesn't live in this delusion of solving other people's problems for them. So, if more people get into trouble, China is extremely happy for them to be in trouble, fighting each other instead of turning their attention on China and bogging everybody down. So, China loves creating conflict. See, there's two aspects to this. One is that they love free radicals, which is countries like North Korea, which destabilizes East Asia, Pakistan, which destabilizes South Asia, etc., etc. Laos, which is increasingly destabilizing Southeast Asia. Uh, they love countries like this because they call them free radicals, who, for a few pennies thrown here and there, are extremely high risk accepting. And they're literally like, the dog in the manger kind of a situation. The second way they do this is to incite conflict, which is very useful for China because America feels this insufferable need to get involved and solve other people's problems for them. So it's a way of bogging down America, and as it is, American finances and their debt to equity ratio are absolute rubbish. They're printing their way out into inflation and economic collapse ultimately. Of course, China's economy isn't great. I mean, that's a different discussion to be had altogether. But you know, it. I think China has seen its opportunity where it can have a war in Ukraine. It can at least try to incite a general conflagration in the Middle East, divert all American resources and attention there, and possibly take over Taiwan.
So you can see any excuse to incite further global tension, isn't it? Um,
Yeah.
yeah. Now, could we take a step back for a moment? If we wind back the clock, so to speak, could you help our viewers with providing a sort of a 5-10 minute summary of the entire Israel Palestine conflict? What is the history behind it? What are the origins behind it? Be grateful if you could tell us all about that.
Oh, see, the question is, how far do you want me to go? Because if you want a complete 10 minutes history, I'll have to go back 3,500 years
Right.
for us to understand what this is. So, should I start 3,500 years back?
Start wherever you think is the most important point, I would say.
See, there's no such thing as the most important point because all of it is relevant to what's happening today. You can't discuss today without discussing 3,500 years back because it has to do with identity. The Jewish identity and the so-called Palestinian identity. So what happens is we know for a fact that these tribes around Israel they existed 3,500 years back. They were pagan. They worshipped a multitude of gods, of whom one was Jehovah, Yahweh, as we know, also called Baal and El and things like that, from which Allah, Elahi, Allah comes. The word Allah comes, who was the thunder god. And 3,500 years back was our first experiment with monotheism anywhere in the world, which a pharaoh called Akhenaten started in Egypt. And what Aten was the disk of the sun. So as long as he was co-ruler with his father, it was henotheism, where Aten was worshipped above all others, but everybody else was also worshipped. But then when he became pharaoh himself, he banned the worship of everybody else and focused on Aten. His empire collapsed. There was a general collapse of the Egyptian empire. But this notion somehow, is it carried on? Is it not? Did people remember this experiment? Did they not? We will never know. Anyway, sometime about 100, 200 years after this, presumably a story starts that Jews were held in captivity in Egypt, and Moses liberates them, and they all move to uh, 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 Israel. We know for a fact this is complete codswallop because we know the story itself was concocted 1,000 years later, right? And how do we know this? Because the oldest description really goes back to about 1177 BC, which is the firm date of the Bronze Age collapse. And what happens out there is you have these Mediterranean raiders called the Sea People. Some are called the Shardana, but one is very specifically identified as the Peleset. And this particular people called the Peleset, the name coincides with the Hebrew word for invader, which is Palaishtu. And what happens is they set up these colonies along the Levantine coast, which become permanent colonies at that point of time, right? But the main impact of this is the word that it creates in Hebrew, which is palaishtu, which means invader. Now, these people are not native to there. Palaishtu obviously come from somewhere else to be called invader, but they adopt all the local gods. Now, at this point, the Palaishtu and the Hebrews were worshipping the exact same gods, contrary to what the Bible tells you. The main difference seems to have been ethnic, and that the fact that the people in the hills around Jerusalem is a hilly area, were not eating pork at all. There was some kind of a taboo on pork, whereas the people on the coast worshipping the same gods were consuming copious quantities of pork. Anyway, what happens is The Palashtu get overcome by the people living in the hills, which becomes the so-called unified kingdom of Israel, which most people think didn't exist. And then it splits between a northern part called Israel and a southern part called Judah, which are slowly over the course of 200-300 years decimated by the Assyrians and the Egyptians and all of this. Now, what happens is, because there are too many power centers, many gods means many priestly hierarchies, which means several different political power centers compared to the king. One of these kings, called Hezekiah, suddenly goes into the temple of Yahweh, which is just one of several temples of several gods being worshipped by the proto Jews at this time. And he says, "Oh my God, look at this. I have found these two tablets, which are the 10 Commandments of God, which were given to a chap called Moses 500 years back, concocted out of thin air, incidentally." And the story later develops 200 years down the line that this all happened in Egypt, because 200 years down the line, Assyria wasn't the main enemy, Egypt became the main enemy. So it made sense to have a pharaoh called Nesho was invading the Levant. That is how the story of the Exodus develops. All the genetic evidence shows you that the Hebrews have always been living out there. They do not have any extraneous this thing, other than natural mixing, because of after they left their country and everything, they've gotten a lot of admixture. But I challenge anybody who's been to Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, and Israel to differentiate between an Israeli and a Jordanian, Israeli and a Syrian, and an Israeli and a Lebanese person. You cannot tell the difference. You simply cannot tell the difference, because they all look kind of European. They could easily pass off as Italians or Greeks. So it's a fantastic admixture. Nobody's pure blood out here. Remember, it's a great melting pot, because the Romans used to call it Mare Nostrum, RC, and that's what the Mediterranean was called. And it was a great melting pot. Rome had Arab emperors. It had two Arab emperors. One chap was called Philip the Arab, who was an Arab, and the other was a guy called Heliogabalus, who, curiously enough, was the original name for Jehovah, El Gabal. So El Gabalus becomes Heliogabalus or whatever. Sorry, I'm getting into too much detail, aren't I? But anyway,
No, it's good.
because these are issues of identity. Remember, it's very complex to negotiate identity issues. Anyway, you come to the Roman period. There's a big rebellion against Rome, because what happens is the Greeks don't insist that you worship their gods, but the Romans do, because paying homage to the divine emperor is part of the Roman way of showing that you accept you are a Roman citizen. But Hezekiah's monotheism and saying there is only Jehovah as per these 10 commandments means you cannot accept any other god. And so there is a rebellion in 72 AD, which is crushed and the Jews are dispersed, but then they're allowed to come back after 10-15 years. But the latent causes do not go away. But what happens is, Jerusalem is renamed Aelia Capitolina, the temple is destroyed, and a temple of Jupiter is built in place of the Jewish temple of Jehovah out there. Again, you can't worship the emperor, you refuse to worship the emperor. Another rebellion comes out in either 148 or 138 or maybe 130 AD, sometime 130 years AD ish. And this time the Romans are very clear, we're going to disperse you all, you're not allowed to come back. Over 100 years, Rome becomes 100, 200 years, Rome becomes Christian. And by this time, Christianity, remember, you started off as a Jewish branch.
Mhm.
But Peter and Paul realized two things. One, if it could not grow in the Roman Empire if Rome was the enemy that crucified its God. So they invent the story of Pontius Pilate washing his hands and leaving the decision up to the Jewish priesthood called the Sanhedrin, who insists that Jesus will be crucified. So the blame for the crucifixion is removed from Rome. Rome was innocent. It was the Jewish priests who did it. And the second, they get rid of their dietary requirements of eating pork because they realize it can't spread. The same way that as long as Buddhism hung on to vegetarianism, it could not spread. The moment it allowed you to eat absolutely anything, it conquered the whole of East Asia, right? They realized this, they made the modifications. The problem was when Rome, so first you've made it friendly with Rome, and then the more problematic aspect is the Jews killed our God. And that is where blood libel and hatred starts off. And so when the Roman Empire becomes Christian, the hatred of the Jews becomes ideological. It's no longer a matter of good governance keeping the Jews away from their land. It is now an ideological issue that God killers can't be allowed to thrive. And there is a Christian restriction against usury, which is to say money lending and interest, which complicates things a lot more. Okay, now what ends up happening is I'm going to fast forward through European history because everybody thinks history is European history, and so I'm not going to go through all the pogroms and things like that in the Middle Ages and things. Just very simply to say that why these pogroms happened is because Christians were not allowed to lend money. It only the Jews could lend money. And there were only two communities in Europe at that time, Christians and Jews. Pagans were killed off. Jews are kind of Christians, so they can't be killed off, but they're the dirty Christians who killed our God. Christian aligned who killed our God. They're people of the book. But because they owe, lots of people owe them money, lots of powerful people owe them money, every time a lord could not pay them money, he would invoke blood libel. They killed our God, and so they took my child and sacrificed him and drank his blood on their Saturday rituals. And the entire mob congregates and goes and kills off the Jewish moneylender and the community out there. It's a fantastic way of taking money and not having to pay back your debt. And that was the root of several pogroms that happened throughout Europe. All of this changes with the Industrial Revolution in the 1800s. It is no surprise that it is the Industrial Revolution that ends slavery and it leads to the emancipation of Jews. Because for industry, you can't have forced work. Industry needs quality control. Quality control is a function of labor. You cannot have slaves. You need motivated workers to do quality control. And that is why slavery is not conducive to quality control. And that is why you see the northern industrial American states liberate southern slaves. That is why Britain, which is turning industrial, starts championing anti slavery almost like proselytization, as does France, right? Purely because of industry, not out of the goodness of their heart or any Christian virtue or anything like that. At the same time, industry needs capital. It needs a steady stream of capital. It is not an agrarian economy. And a steady stream of capital means regulatory mechanisms and guaranteed payback mechanisms where not paying back is penalized by the state, which is where Jews start getting emancipated because they ran all the capital out there. It wasn't out of the goodness of Europe's heart or the enlightenment that the Jew was emancipated. It was because the systems of money usury that had been left to the Jews, like scavenging or things would be left to the Dalits in India, kind of thing, were left to the Jews because it was dirty work. Uh, provided that capital, and that is why Jews were then brought back in from the cold. Then, of course, you had the Holocaust and things, which I'm not going to go into. But before that, what happens is the First World War. Because remember, all these states, Israel, Syria, Palestine, Jordan, whatever, are all under the Ottoman Empire at this point of time.
Yeah.
Now, since the Roman province of Syria, Palestina, the Romans, when they renamed Jerusalem Aelia Capitolina in 72 AD, they do not refer to it as a province of Judah anymore. They change the name to Syria Palestina. Why? Because they want to insult the Jews, they choose the name invader from Hebrew. It is done deliberately to insult them. The same way the Nalanda railway station is called Bakhtiyar Khilji station. Why?
Mm.
It is called Bakhtiyarpur. Why? It was named Bakhtiyarpur to reinforce the fact that we destroyed Nalanda and we want to show Turkish superiority. And that is why the Romans named that province Palestine, to crush. After they did to the Jews what was done to Nalanda, they had to show What is the most insulting term we can use? Invader. So Syria of the invader was what it was named, Syria Palestina. That is the first real use of the word Palestina other than the Peleshet Pelestu, which had about, and these people, Pelestu could also be Jews today, by the way, the original Pelestu. Uh, Now, what ends up happening out here is, since that province collapses when the Arabs take over, there is no Palestine at all. Uh, None of the Ottoman provinces were called Palestine. Uh, what is today Israel was divided into four, five different counties or districts or what have you, or provincial divisions, none of which was called Palestine. When the Ottoman Empire is defeated in the First World War in 1920, the Allies impose terms on it, which is the entire Levant, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, Palestine, Kuwait, all have to be ceded to them. The north is given to France, the south and the east are given to Britain. And all these countries had great delusions of being inheritors of the Roman Empire, which is why even in London you will see lots of so-called Roman architecture. The statue of Boadicea, for example, is done in the Roman style. It is definitely not done in the Celtic style that Boadicea was a Celt. The British, named their part of that area as Palestine for the first time. And this is done under a treaty called the Treaty of Sèvres, which is, Sèvres porcelain, Limoges and Sèvres porcelain. Sorry, in English we say Sèvres, but we all know it's pronounced Sèvres. But the Treaty of Sèvres. And what happens in the Treaty of Sèvres is it does two things. For the first time in about 1,700 years, it reestablishes the name Palestine, and it recognizes the right of Jews to return to that place. Again, after about 1,800, 1,900 years. So here's the issue. If you accept that the creation of Palestine is legal, you have to accept that the right of the Jews to return is equally legal. You can't claim one is legal and the other is illegal. Right? Now, Jews coming in there leads to a great blossoming. This area was completely desertified. It wasn't a desert before Roman rule, but under Roman rule, it was desertified because of the military requirements out there. All the trees were chopped down, and things like that. And what ends up happening is that because the Jews are turning the land green, and they're employing lots of local Sunni Muslims, it leads to social friction because this is essentially a feudal empire on its last legs. And the Ottoman Empire, what was the ruling dispensation before. And Sunni groups don't like this because feudal lords are having their power taken away. People who they could control at any given point of time are now getting regular jobs with the Jews, agricultural jobs or industrial jobs, which these guys don't want because it reduces their power, it reduces their social control. And so they start off terrorism against the Jews, and the Jews respond in kind. So there's to and fro massacres happening out there. The Holocaust happens simultaneously, say 15, 20 years down the line. By this time, there is a significant majority of Jews in what is today northern Israel. And the UN partition plan then does something. They'll tell you the Jews were only 20%, but they were given 60% of the land. Not true. They were given 20% of the land which they were large, and they were given a huge chunk of land that was completely barren desert. I want our viewers to Google the Negev desert and tell me what the hell can grow in the Negev desert. Nothing, zero. All the Muslim majority areas were given to the Muslims. The desert was given to the Jews. They did not want that. And so when Israel declares independence in borders defined by the UN, they don't want to accept UN. They don't want to accept the treaty. They want to accept part of the Treaty of Sèvres that creates a Palestine that has never existed mentally. You name one Palestinian leader before 1920. Nobody will be able to name one. Name one prime minister of Palestine in exile or one leader of Palestine in exile before 1920. There is none. But I can name Jewish leaders who have identified themselves as either the king of Israel or the leader of global Jewry or whatever for the last 3,000 years. And they invade this newly formed state, which fights back very successfully. It creates borders. And what happens is, in this entire process, it leaves out two strips, the what is called the West Bank and Gaza. Gaza is absorbed by Egypt and it is put under military rule. The West Bank is actually annexed by Jordan. Jordan annexes the West Bank, declares it Jordanian territory, doesn't put it under military rule. It is claimed that it is Jordan proper, which is why two-thirds of Jordan's population is actually Palestinian, so called Palestinian. Right? And this is very problematic because after 88, King Hussein of Jordan is forced to give up his dreams of conquering the whole of Israel and calling it Transjordan. And so he accepts that the West Bank is actually Palestine. And the Palestinian identity is something that did not exist before 1920. If somebody tells you that Palestine has always existed, I'm sorry, the historical link between the Peleseth Paleshtu to the Roman Syria Palestina to British Palestine is purely etymological. There is no historical connection between the two. Etymology is not history. Etymology is etymology, and history is history. Etymology is not ethnicity. Right? So it is, and everybody wanted that plot of land for themselves. Egypt wanted it for itself. Jordan wanted it for itself. Jordan was much more honest in that it annexed. Egypt ran it as a military protectorate, the so-called Free Palestinian Government, whatever that meant. But that's how things roll. So, I leave it up to people to make their own choices, what is right and what is wrong out here, because I don't think people go far back enough in history to prehistory to figure out identity issues. And I think it's very important we go that far back to figure out identity issues. I'm sorry, I took up way too long.
No, that was absolutely brilliant. And I think more people should do exactly what you've just done and just go back in time, go back, look into the history, and you'll find all the answers there. Thanks for that. I think you should potentially rethink your job and become a history teacher because I don't know about you, Chithi viewers, but I definitely learnt a lot here. So thanks for that. Now you talked about speaking of hatred of a particular community, an awful yet another awful consequence of this is the frightening level of anti-Semitism that is just rampant, especially on social media. We've seen Israeli victim posters taken down, comments like "from the river to the sea," etc. As a Hindu community, we could easily be next in another sort of conflict, and Hindu Messiah would be, the leading point. I don't know if you've seen videos of hundreds of people, Islamists targeting one Jewish gentleman, I think. So it's just absolutely awful to see. How do we stop this hatred and misinformation? And just leading off from this, if you can, could you then help our audiences understand why India and Hindus particularly stand by Israel and the Jewish community?
Hmm. So, the thing is, these networks, this Islamo lefto networks, they are the exact ones that have been hammering on against Hindutva. And notice the sheer hypocrisy of their position that political Islam is fine, but political Judaism called Zionism is wrong, and political Hinduism called Hindutva is wrong. It is the same people who are expressing the greatest levels of anti Semitism today who have in the past expressed Hindu misya. Plus, liberal East Coast and West Coast Jews as well, who have been extremely Hindu misic, because a lot of this vokery was funded, encouraged, and fueled by them. Now, has their reality check that has been delivered to them because of this going to translate into a reawakening of these Western so called liberal Jews towards Hindu Mizya? Maybe, may not be, I don't know. But understand that these are the same networks that have targeted Hindus, who have targeted Jews. Tomorrow, if folks crossed over from Pakistan and did the same thing in Rajasthan or Punjab, these same people would be celebrating that. Remember, the protests that we see started off the day Hamas did this, way before the Israeli response became clear. So it wasn't to prevent what Israel is going to do, it was to celebrate what Hamas did. And they have a great deal of sophistry in explaining away these things. So it shouldn't surprise us at all. What we see, we need to be very clear about. What is being done to the Jews will be done to us at some point. It will be celebrated. What is being weaponized against Israel today will be weaponized against us. And as for why Indians have a great affinity for Jews, well, it's very simple. It's the underdog. It's a little country holding out against a sea almost 100,000 times probably bigger than them, immeasurably bigger than them in terms of population, and one little country holding out. It's also the civilizational affinity that, it's the two weird countries that invented a lot of religions, but the original Bronze Age religion remained in both countries, whereas the children of that Bronze Age religion became wildly popular across the world. Buddhism here and Christianity and Islam there. So it's a whole load of historical stuff. It's support for the underdog, and it's tactile because we suffer from a lot of the hatred and terrorism that Jews go through and Israel goes through.
Exactly.
It's that simple.
Thank you for that. Yeah, that's an incredibly simple answer, and I think everyone will be able to understand that. Now, turning away from all of this, completely different topic. There's been some breaking news about the Congress party and Rahul Gandhi complaining, seemingly, about their phones being allegedly hacked by the Modi government. So, what is this all about? What do you think? What's your response to this?
Look, I mean, the 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 simplest thing here is, look at the facts of the case. I'm not even going to read out the documents and things, but you remember a year back there was this whole thing about Pegasus, how the government had bought this Pegasus malware, or rather spyware, to infect people's phones. Uh, if they had used Pegasus, they would not need to hack. So one actually cancels out the other. We knew Pegasus was a bullshit story, but the latest hacking story completely proves that the Pegasus story was bullshit. Number one. Number two, the kind of brute force hacking that is claiming was done, a domestic government doesn't need to do it because a domestic government has 100,000 different ways of hacking your phone without you knowing it. It is only foreign governments, especially in a heavily digitized country like India, it is only foreign governments that don't have access to your digital banking and other databases, social biometric databases, that need to hack your phone. So, just in terms of sheer logistics, for the Indian government to have done it, it does not need to have done it. There are much more elegant and sophisticated ways of hacking your phone for India not to have to do this.
Well, I think enough said about that. Yeah, we'll just have to see how the story pans out. Well, Abhijit, thank you so much. You have been so eloquent and you've enlightened us all on the deeper reasons behind this ongoing and heinous conflict. To our viewers, please do share this video. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and, of course, follow us on all our social media handles. We go out of our way to bring you the facts that the mainstream media won't. And if you'd like to find out what drives people and communities to commit acts of atrocious war and violence against others, please watch this upcoming video from the masterful Jeffrey Armstrong G. You definitely don't want to miss that. He gives an illuminating explanation on all of it, so please give that a watch. Abhijit, thank you so much for joining me today. It's been a pleasure having you on the channel once again, and we look forward to the next time you'll, of course, be appearing on our screens. Thank you very much. Until the next time, thank you and namaste.
Thank you so much, Anandi. It's always lovely to talk to you. Thank you so much.
Please remember to subscribe to us and switch on the notifications for this channel. For our other social media links, more content, and to support our work, please visit citti.net. धन्यवाद. नमस्कार.